Horror to me was a way to bond with my sibling. I have 3 older brothers, but one of them I was always closest in age with, and he was like my best friend. And so that was what he was into. So that's what got me into it. I think what horror is for me is because it is so vast. It's not just like horror. There's comedy horror, there's sci-fi, there's so many different genres of it. And I think that's why it's my favorite genre, is because you can do so much with it. And I think as a pre-med psych student, what's really important when thinking about horror is a lot of people don't think it means that much, but as someone with a mental illness as well, I think it is truly an escape from reality. And it's a creative outlet for me, at least, to take like what is actually going on in my head and to put it into visuals in sort of a horrific way to represent how my brain actually works and feels. And I think it's really important for people to see that, because not just making it but seeing it does release a lot of what a lot of people could be holding in or holding back or not even realizing. And I think part of people that don't even realize that they need this in their life, like watching it, they do have that process in their brain that's really helpful for them to release tension, fear. Like, it's a lot of times like people are really scared of something. They're like, well, you just got to do it. You just got to do it, and then you won't be scared of it anymore. And I think that a lot of that is with horror film too. Like, once you watch it, it kind of takes a little bit away from you, and it's not that big fear, that big pressure on your mind. So not only a creative outlet, but I feel like viewers as well can get a lot from horror film.
Okay, to me, I feel like every single person has this dark spot in their head, and it's a dark spot that we feel guilty for just picking at, but we always do it. We just always have to go for it, and I feel like there hasn't been a single person who hasn't felt questionable about something that they saw or something they read or watched. They just feel this inner need to just dig at it, and I feel like we've all been there. I've a long time ago I read an autopsy book that I felt very guilty about reading after I read it, but I realized that that was beyond me. I felt like I needed to learn about it, and I think that's why horror is so important, because I feel like it is the escape that is acceptable for all of us. I mean, you can't question a horror film when someone says they've seen one. Everyone's seen it, but it's just that curiosity spot, the dark spot in our head, that makes it okay. It's an ease. It's like movie heroin. You know what I mean? You've gotta dig in there. You've gotta let it out, and you gotta be curious.
My thing about horror movies is that, much like, because I love mythology, I love a lot of different stories throughout history, and if you look at these sort of things, horror has always been sort of ingrained in them, from even old grim fairy tales to Norse mythology to Roman. Every culture has their own sort of horror, their own sort of like visceral things with their stories, and every generation has their sort of own mythos, and movies have become that sort of thing to our generations and our culture. And to me, that's the importance of them. They sort of represent our fears as a society, our nightmares, things that scare us, not just with like things like the boogeyman or like generic things like Frankenstein, but things like zombies representing like millennials stuck on their cell phones, or in the Night of the Living Dead, when the way they carry him off, it's a lot like the protests when they would send the dogs on protesting African Americans. This whole thing, it shows such a darker, more side to society that we don't like talking about. And our generation can be incredibly pessimistic about government and everything else. And to me, this sort of gives us this outlet to be creative in a time when creativity is extremely difficult to be, because it's getting harder and harder for artists to make money because of our industrialized ways. And this gives us this way to show visually these fears, these nightmares that we are experiencing growing up in this brave new world.
No matter your personal taste in movies, you have to admit it's impressive that horror has maintained itself as such a powerful genre over all these years. While other somewhat abnormal genres such as fantasy and science fiction seem to come and go in popularity as pop culture sees fit, horror has continuously inspired audiences to flock in droves to theaters to see the next gruesome hit. Why has it kept this presence in our culture? Because horror is more vital to well-being than many people realize. And in today's video, I will discuss why horror is a fundamental part of an ever-growing society. It's true that some of horror's popularity can be attributed to our fascination for the deranged, and the sense of pride that arises from sitting through a terrifying film with only minimal shrieking. However, there is a much more important reason as to why horror is so appealing: the concept of catharsis. Catharsis is defined as the process of releasing and thereby providing relief from strong or repressed emotions. The reason why catharsis can be applied to this genre is because horror's main goal, much like comedy, is to evoke an emotional response from its audience. And when you feel the emotions of horror, fear, disgust, abandonment, you allow yourself to experience and release these feelings that may have been sitting inside you for days as a result of something that happened to you in real life. And even though some psychologists and philosophers would argue that viewing and finding comfort within horror content can only cause damage to us and our ability to empathize with others, what these professionals seem to forget is that horror isn't the causation of negative feelings, but simply a reaction and representation of them. Murder, torture, war, all of these things are very real terrors caused by very real ideas that come from within. Horror only takes these stories and recreates them in a way that's easier for us to digest and grasp an understanding of. But if you want a true case of catharsis within horror, take this story for example. In 1990, psychiatrists J.M. Turley and A.P. Derdane decided to conduct their own research regarding cinematic neurosis, a term coined by Bruce Ballin and Molly Lech to describe the development of anxiety, somatic responses, dissociation, and even psychotic symptoms after watching a film. Turley and Derdane discussed the experience they had with a case involving a 13-year-old boy who wasn't necessarily experiencing anxiety or panic from viewing horror films, but had developed a strange addiction to watching the 1984 classic A Nightmare on Elm Street. The boy was seemingly obsessed with Freddy Krueger, sympathizing for him and his situation instead of fearing him. After several sessions of discussing the film with the therapist, he and the boy, together, were able to conclude that the boy's obsession with the film and love for Krueger was the result of the boy identifying with Krueger's hatred for his mother. The boy, having been abandoned by his own mother at a younger age, was finding solace in some sort of therapeutic experience from watching and feeling the emotions of Freddy. And once those pent-up feelings of abandonment and anger were purged, the boy moved on to other cinematic interests. The fairly new genre of children's horror is really gaining traction for this exact reason, that horror allows people of all ages an outlet for negative feelings. In her journal, The Children's Horror Film, Catherine Lester states that allowing children to watch watered-down horror such as Paranorman or Goosebumps can be therapeutic for the child, allowing them to learn how to confront and cope with negative feelings and give them a better chance at being able to deal with feelings of anxiety, stress, and depression as they continue into adulthood. And obviously, this doesn't apply only to children. Men and women since the dawn of horror have used it as a way to discuss their fears and views in the world. Frankenstein, for example, shows the danger of science if it's taken too far. Dracula is all about the dangers of sexual repression, and Night of the Living Dead provides a solid insight to how racism, sexism, and other atrocities have turned us into the monsters. This is why horror is so important in society and will continue to be a large presence in our world. It is one of the only genres that provides us with a raw, unfiltered view of the world and causes us to think and reflect on how it is and how we want it to be. Without horror, we wouldn't have this outlet for discussing the uncomfortable. And without discussing these things, the nation can't progress. Horror will always be the epitome of the freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and freedom of expression. So here's to another century of excellent, terrifying, gut-wrenching horror.